There are moments in life when silence becomes louder than any spoken word, and sometimes the quiet you left behind echoes in the heart of someone who swore they'd moved on. Ladies and gentlemen, life has a way of teaching us lessons long after the moment has passed. You see, a person can walk into a new relationship, smile in new photos, and convince the world and maybe even themselves that they've turned the page. But the truth, sometimes the silence of the past still speaks. When silence enters a person's life, it does not arrive gently, nor does it sit quietly in a corner. It occupies space. It stretches itself across the hours of the day, filling the gaps where conversations, arguments, laughter, or explanations once lived. When you remove your voice, he is left with the one sound he cannot turn off, his own thoughts. At first, he may try to dismiss them, drown them out, or bury them under distractions. But silence has a persistence that noise never does. Noise ends, silence lingers, and in that stillness, he meets the version of himself he has avoided for far too long. That's the beginning of self-reflection, not by choice, but by circumstance. This kind of self-reflection does not show up as a calm, thoughtful meditation. It comes as a discomfort. It's that uneasy feeling when the world quiets down and the mind starts replaying moments he never evaluated fully. Your silence becomes a mirror, and mirrors don't lie. Without your reactions, your explanations, your emotional presence buffering his decisions, he has no one else to point to, no one else to blame, no one else to interpret the situation for him. He is forced to revisit conversations he dismissed, your concerns he minimized, or moments he handled without care. Silence presses him to consider the version of himself he projected, and the version he actually was. That tension between perception and reality becomes louder than any argument you ever had. What once slipped by unnoticed now demands attention. A small comment you made months ago suddenly gains meaning. A behavior you tolerated becomes something he questions. The patience you gave him now feels heavier because he can see how much space you allowed him and how little he filled it with growth. He begins to understand the weight of things he shrugged off. Silence sharpens memory in a way words never do. Words can be debated, denied, twisted. Silence cannot. It stands as an unchanging truth, and in that truth he is confronted with responsibility. The responsibility to acknowledge where he fell short, where he ignored your needs, and where he failed to show up as the person he claimed to be. In this self-reflection, he also sees his patterns more clearly. Patterns that were easy to hide when he had the comfort of your presence, your reassurance, your questions, your attempts to bridge emotional gaps. Silence removes that bridge. He is left standing on his side of the canyon, looking across at everything you carried for both of you. Without your presence maintaining the emotional landscape, he notices how much he relied on you to keep things balanced. He sees the emotional labor you performed quietly, the maturity you offered without applause. And this realization is not gentle. It comes with a sting that grows sharper every time he recognizes a truth he didn't want to face when you were still there. Silence also forces him to confront the way he responds to loss. Not just the loss of you, but the loss of access, the loss of familiarity, the loss of being able to predict your reactions. When you were present, even in conflict, he understood the rules of engagement. But silence removes the rules, it removes the map. He doesn't know what you think, how you feel, or what you've come to understand in your absence. And that unknown becomes its own form of reflection. It makes him analyze his own emotional intelligence, or lack of it. It makes him realize how much he depended on your openness to navigate the relationship. Now he must rely on his own clarity, and he finds that clarity is harder to access when he can't hide behind your voice. Over time, the silence transforms from something he resents into something he examines. He begins to see how much of his identity within the relationship depended on your presence. Without you, he evaluates not just what he did, but who he was. Self-reflection becomes less about the specific memories and more about the patterns he repeated across them. Was he dismissive? Was he avoidant? Did he listen or merely hear? Did he take you for granted because he assumed you'd always be there to fill the spaces he left empty? These questions don't fade. They intensify. Silence becomes the teacher he never asked for but absolutely needed. And in facing himself honestly, sometimes for the first time, he grows aware that the real impact of your silence is not that it removed you from his life, but that it forced him to finally meet the parts of himself he had always kept hidden. When someone steps into a new relationship, the world assumes they've moved on. They appear happy, occupied, redirected. But what most people don't understand is that new love doesn't scrub away old lessons. It doesn't erase the emotional imprints left behind, nor does it replace the inner voice that whispers reminders of what once was. Even in the warmth of new affection, there are quiet pockets of thought where the past slips in. Not because he wants the past back, but because emotional experiences don't vanish simply because he's chosen a different path. The remnants of what you two lived through still sit in the corners of his mind, and they surface at the moments he least expects. In a new relationship, he may find himself navigating familiar patterns, yet noticing them more sharply this time. The new person may express a concern or highlight a behavior, and suddenly something clicks. It feels familiar. It feels like déjà vu, not because the relationship is the same, but because he recognizes a version of himself that once stood in front of you. Your silence makes that recognition heavier. Before, he could tell himself that your reactions were exaggerated, emotional, or unfair. But now, when someone new reacts to something similar, he can no longer deny the pattern. He sees the thread that connects both situations, and in that realization, he cannot escape the truth that maybe the problem wasn't the dynamic, it was him. New relationships often reveal old wounds. They expose the areas where growth was needed but never pursued. Even if he is happy, even if the relationship is healthy, there will be moments where the past taps him on the shoulder. Perhaps it's a gesture he misses for a moment. Perhaps it's a habit of yours he only now realizes he appreciated. Or perhaps it's something deeper. A conversation he never handled well with you but finds himself confronting again, now from someone else. This isn't nostalgia, it's reflection. The new relationship becomes a mirror to the old one, highlighting the lessons he never fully learned. And because you're silent now, he can't return to the past for validation or explanation. He must sit with those realizations alone. The emotional residue of your relationship is not a burden he carries intentionally. It's simply the reality of human experience. People don't reset just because they've replaced a partner. Emotional connections don't disappear on demand. The mind stores moments, memories, and lessons the same way it stores wounds and warnings. So even as he builds something new, those fragments of your relationship overlay his perception. When he reacts differently this time, when he chooses patience instead of frustration or openness instead of avoidance, that shift is shaped in part by the silent lessons your absence taught him. Your relationship didn't end without teaching him something. You walked away, but the impact stayed, and yet this awareness does not always bring comfort. There are moments when he becomes aware of how he failed to appreciate something you offered so freely. A kindness, a softness, a consistency. He might experience something in the new relationship that reminds him he once received that same thing from you but didn't value it until now. That kind of realization comes with weight. And sometimes the silence you left behind hurts more than any conversation ever did. A conversation would have allowed him to respond, defend, deny, or justify. Silence gives him none of that. It simply leaves him with the truth, and truth has a way of dissolving any illusion of having been the better or wiser one. Ultimately, the new relationship doesn't erase the past, it highlights it. It shows him where he grew too late, where he learned the hard way, and where he failed to notice the importance of things you once offered him freely. Moving on doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean his heart is immune to reflection. Your silence didn't vanish when he found someone new. It becomes a quiet teacher, shaping the ways he shows up now, reminding him of what he mishandled before, and provoking the kind of growth that only becomes possible when a person sees themselves clearly. In this way, the new relationship doesn't replace the old one. It reveals everything he didn't understand until you stop speaking. Absence has a way of revealing truths that presence used to soften. When you were still in his life, even if things were complicated, even if there were misunderstandings, your presence carried a kind of emotional cushioning. He could ignore certain things because he knew you were still there. He could overlook small cracks because he believed there was time to fix them. But once you removed yourself, once you stepped back and went silent, those hidden cracks started showing. Your absence stripped away the comfort that allowed him to avoid accountability. Suddenly, he didn't have your reactions to gauge, your questions to answer, or your emotions to navigate. All he had left was the unfiltered reality of who he was when no one else was holding the mirror. When someone is present, their very existence can distract from the deeper truth. He could look at you and focus on your flaws, your mistakes, or your emotional responses. He could assign blame outwardly, but when you left, he noticed something startling. Without you around, the same problems still existed within him. Your absence took away the easy explanations, the convenient narratives, and the comfortable illusion. It forced him to see that the things he thought were your issues were often his own patterns projected onto you. And now, with no one else around to absorb his emotional chaos, those patterns became undeniable. Absence has a way of changing the angle of the spotlight. Suddenly, it illuminates him instead of you. The truth is, presence can mask behavior. When you were there, he could lean on the moments of happiness to convince himself everything was fine. He could rely on your consistency, your patience, or your emotional flexibility to keep things afloat. He didn't fully comprehend how much of the relationship's stability came from your effort, not his. But absence removes that illusion. Now he sees the imbalance clearly. He sees the times you tried harder than he did. He sees how many times you bridged the emotional distance while he stayed comfortable. And the more he recognizes that, the more he realizes he mistook your strength for simplicity, because only when you were gone did he grasp how much you actually carried. In the space left behind, he finds himself replaying moments with a new lens. Not the lens he used when you were still there, trying to protect his ego or justify his actions, but the lens that absence forces upon a person, the lens of truth. He sees your gestures differently now. The way you communicated, the way you showed up, the way you tried to bring things back to balance, These moments were easy to dismiss before because your presence made it seem like you'd always fight for the relationship. He assumed there would always be another conversation, another chance to make it right. But absence reminds him that people eventually stop trying when they realize they're trying alone. And once that reality sinks in, it reshapes every memory he has of you. Absence also reveals the depth of someone's emotional maturity, or the lack of it. When you were present, he didn't have to sit with his weaknesses. He could rely on your emotional intuition to guide difficult conversations. He could rely on your empathy to smooth over conflict, but when you left, he found himself face to face with emotions he never learned to manage: loneliness, regret, self-doubt, accountability. These feelings rushed in, not because he missed you romantically, but because he realized how much of his emotional development he outsourced to you. Your absence made him aware of the gaps within himself, gaps that were easy to hide when you were filling them without him noticing. And perhaps the most powerful revelation your absence creates is the realization that some things he once dismissed were actually the things that mattered most. The small habits you had, the stability you offered, the loyalty you showed, the emotional maturity you demonstrated even when he didn't match it. When you were present, these things felt ordinary to him, expected, normal, guaranteed. But absence redefines value. It turns routine into rarity. It turns overlooked gestures into significant memories. And now he recognizes that what he once viewed as simple was actually profound. Your presence hid the truth because he took it for granted. Your absence reveals the truth because he can finally see what he failed to appreciate when he had the chance. Unanswered questions have a way of echoing in the mind long after a relationship ends. When silence takes the place of closure, the mind becomes its own story teller, filling in the blanks, replaying memories, and searching for explanations that never arrive. For him, your silence didn't just create distance, it created a mystery. A mystery about what you truly felt, what you finally realized, and what you chose to walk away from. When people don't get answers, they don't move on cleanly. They circle back mentally, trying to understand the moment everything shifted. And that quiet wondering becomes its own form of emotional noise. He may be in a new relationship now, but silence doesn't care about new chapters. It only cares about unresolved ones. At first, he may have treated your silence like a power move, something temporary, something you'd eventually break. But the longer it stayed, the more weight it gained. Silence is complicated because it forces a person to confront truths they might not have wanted to hear. If you had spoken, he could have argued. If you had explained, he could have defended. If you had expressed anger, he could have countered with justification. But silence offers none of that. It offers no platform for debate, no opening to reshape the narrative, no chance to reclaim the upper hand. Your quiet becomes the only response he gets, and because it cannot be manipulated, it becomes the most honest one. In that honesty, he begins to question things he never questioned before. There is a specific kind of frustration that comes from not knowing what you truly felt, not knowing where things went wrong, not knowing whether you were hurting or healing. That frustration builds pressure internally, forcing him to revisit old conversations with a different awareness. He starts to notice the moments he dismissed too casually, the times he ignored your emotional cues, the times you expressed a need and he didn't take it seriously. These memories replay not because he longs for the past, but because your silence keeps pushing him back to the beginning of the story, asking him to understand the parts he refused to read. And the more he examines it, the more he realizes how many answers were hidden in plain sight, answers he never valued until it was too late. Silence has a way of making a person re-experience the relationship from your perspective. Without your voice guiding or contradicting his thoughts, he fills the gaps with possibility. Maybe he hurt you more than he realized. Maybe you were struggling in ways he never acknowledged. Maybe your silence means you found peace somewhere he could never reach. These may not be the real reasons, but without answers, the mind explores every potential truth, and that exploration is uncomfortable. It is humbling. It forces him to confront the possibility that he misread you, misunderstood you, underestimated you. Silence becomes the blank page where he writes his regrets, even if he doesn't admit them out loud. What's most unsettling is that silence removes the closure he expected. He might have thought there would be a final conversation, a final argument, a final emotional exchange, something that tied up the loose ends, but your silence left threads hanging, and unfinished stories keep the mind busy. Every person wants to feel like they understood the past, even if they don't want to go back to it. Without closure, the past becomes an unsolved equation he keeps trying to balance. He plays scenarios in his head that he never replayed when you were still around. He wonders what you think of him now, what you've learned about life without him, what parts of him you forgot easily, and what parts of him you never forgot at all. Silence doesn't erase curiosity, it intensifies it. And perhaps the most powerful effect of unanswered questions is that they force growth. Even if he doesn't speak it, even if he buries it beneath new routines and new affection, there is a part of him that cannot escape the emotional echo your silence created. It is not about missing you. It is not about wanting the relationship back. It is about the unsettling awareness that he never got to rewrite his side of the story. Your silence became the final chapter, not because he agreed to it, but because you chose it. And now, in the quiet moments when life slows down, those unanswered questions return, not to haunt him, but to remind him that not everything can be controlled, explained, corrected, or concluded. Some things simply remain. And the mind keeps circling them, trying to understand what you chose not to say. People often confuse moving on with healing, as if stepping into a new relationship magically dissolves the emotional weight of the past. But moving on is external, healing is internal. One can look completely forward while still carrying unprocessed fragments of what came before. He may appear content, present, even invested, but the heart doesn't operate on the same timeline as the mind. Healing requires introspection, ownership, and growth. Moving on only requires motion. Your silence revealed the difference. While he moved forward physically, emotionally, he hadn't yet faced the wounds, the patterns, or the truths left behind. And in the quiet spaces of his new relationship, he now realizes that progression is not the same as transformation. The truth is, he never truly examined the way things ended between you two, not because he didn't care, but because distraction is easier than reflection. A new relationship, with its novelty and excitement, becomes a soothing cover. It gives the illusion of emotional progress, but the moment the excitement settles, the deeper layers surface. This is when he begins to sense the unresolved parts within himself. Maybe he becomes more defensive than he should be. Maybe he shuts down during conflict. Maybe he overcompensates to prove he's grown. These behaviors aren't reactions to the new person. They're symptoms of wounds he never healed. And your silence becomes the backdrop against which these realizations echo more loudly than before. Sometimes the absence of your voice highlights the internal conversations he avoided. When you were there, he didn't have to examine why he reacted the way he did. You questioned it for him. He didn't have to confront his emotional avoidance. You tried to navigate around it. He didn't have to understand his own triggers. You learned to anticipate them. But in this new relationship, he no longer has someone doing that emotional labor quietly in the background. And because he didn't fully heal, old habits show up uninvited. When the new person responds differently than you did, it exposes the emotional shortcuts he relied on and the growth he postponed. He begins to understand that healing is not a byproduct of change. It's a commitment he never made. Healing requires accountability, not the surface level acknowledgement people give when they're trying to appear self-aware, but the deep, uncomfortable kind that demands honesty. Your silence created that demand. Without your presence, he became the only one left to evaluate his behavior. In the new relationship, he sees opportunities for growth that he overlooked before. He sees mistakes repeating, emotional patterns resurfacing, and insecurities reappearing. These are not failures. They are signs that the emotional work was never completed. And because he cannot blame you anymore, he must face the truth that the healing he assumed happened never actually did. Silence becomes the catalyst, not because it hurt him, but because it revealed the gaps he tried to ignore. The emotional residue you left behind is not about longing. It's about recognition. Recognition that some parts of him still carry the imprint of who he was when he was with you. Recognition that some behaviors he thought were harmless actually created distance. Recognition that healing would have required effort, and effort was something he avoided until now. The new relationship magnifies this realization. When he reacts instinctively, when he withdraws instead of communicates, when he fears vulnerability more than he admits, he sees glimpses of the emotional immaturity he once brought to you, and because you are silent now, he cannot revisit the past to soften that truth. He faces it alone, as he should have from the beginning. Perhaps the most humbling part is understanding that moving on came easily because it required nothing from him. Healing, on the other hand, demands everything: self-awareness, responsibility, emotional courage. And when he notices himself struggling in moments where he should be grounded, he is reminded that the past hasn't fully left him. Your silence didn't freeze him in time. It exposed the emotional work unfinished within him. He may not speak it, but deep down, he knows that happiness in a new relationship does not erase the need for healing. It simply makes the absence of that healing more visible, more undeniable, and more urgent. Your silence is not a punishment. It is a boundary. But boundaries, especially when they come from someone who once gave freely, have a way of unsettling those who benefited from the old version of you. When you stop explaining yourself, stop justifying your feelings, stop showing up to absorb someone else's emotional weight, it forces them to recognize that access to you was never guaranteed. He may not admit it, but he feels the shift. Where you once extended understanding, you now offer distance. Where you once tried to make things easier, you now let things be what they are. That change doesn't make you cold. It makes you self-respecting. And that self-respect is what quietly bothers him, because it reminds him of a truth he once ignored. You were always giving more than he realized. Boundaries have a way of highlighting past imbalances. When you withdraw your emotional energy, the absence of that energy becomes painfully obvious. He begins to see how much you accommodated, how often you compromised, and how deeply you cared. He sees it because the space you left behind now feels unfamiliar. In your silence, there are no more reassurances, no more emotional cushioning, no more attempts to keep the peace. And that shift exposes the dependency he never acknowledged, the reliance he had on your emotional generosity. Your silence didn't take anything away from him that he wasn't already taking for granted. It simply revealed the truth of what he was receiving all along. The discomfort he feels doesn't come from your absence. It comes from the meaning behind it. Silence communicates something words cannot, that you no longer feel obligated to participate in explanations that used to exhaust you. It tells him you are choosing yourself, that you have accepted what happened, accepted what cannot be changed, and accepted that not every story needs a final conversation. Your silence says, without saying, that you are no longer willing to shrink yourself to maintain a connection. And that message is louder than any speech you could have given, because silence, when rooted in self-worth, is powerful enough to shift the emotional dynamic without a single word spoken. In this new relationship he's in, your boundary stands out even more. The new person may offer him affection, attention, or even love, but they do not erase the memory of the boundary you set. Boundaries linger. They do not fade with time. They become reference points. He compares how easily you once forgave with how firmly you now protect your peace. He remembers the version of you he had access to, and he recognizes the version of you he can no longer reach. That realization is not about wanting you back, it's about understanding that he lost access not due to distance, but due to his own previous actions. Your silence represents that loss more clearly than words ever could. The truth is, your silence shows maturity he didn't expect. People often assume the one who loved more will be the one who breaks first, reaches out first, or bends their boundaries first. But you didn't. You didn't chase closure. You didn't seek validation. You didn't try to revisit old conversations hoping for a different outcome. Instead, you chose quiet, and that quiet reflects growth. Growth he wasn't prepared to see. Because while he may have moved on externally, your silence shows that you evolved internally. You chose peace over explanation, dignity over emotional chaos, and self-respect over lingering attachment. That kind of growth forces him to reflect on how differently you are carrying yourself now. What bothers him most is not the silence itself, but what the silence symbolizes, that you learned from the past more deeply than he did. Your boundary proves that you understand your worth in a way you didn't before. It proves that you recognize what deserves your energy and what no longer does. It proves that you are capable of loving deeply, but also capable of walking away fully. And that truth unsettles him because it means you didn't lose in the story he once thought he controlled. Your silence is not emptiness, it is empowerment. And while he may not voice it, he feels the shift every time your name crosses his mind. Your silence is not a punishment, it is a boundary. But boundaries, especially when they come from someone who once gave freely, have a way of unsettling those who benefited from the old version of you. When you stop explaining yourself, stop justifying your feelings, stop showing up to absorb someone else's emotional weight, it forces them to recognize that access to you was never guaranteed. He may not admit it, but he feels the shift. Where you once extended understanding, you now offer distance. Where you once tried to make things easier, you now let things be what they are. That change doesn't make you cold. It makes you self-respecting. And that self-respect is what quietly bothers him, because it reminds him of a truth he once ignored. You were always giving more than he realized. Boundaries have a way of highlighting past imbalances. When you withdraw your emotional energy, the absence of that energy becomes painfully obvious. He begins to see how much you accommodated, how often you compromised, and how deeply you cared. He sees it because the space you left behind now feels unfamiliar. In your silence, there are no more reassurances, no more emotional cushioning, no more attempts to keep the peace. And that shift exposes the dependency he never acknowledged, the reliance he had on your emotional generosity. Your silence didn't take anything away from him that he wasn't already taking for granted. It simply revealed the truth of what he was receiving all along. The discomfort he feels doesn't come from your absence. It comes from the meaning behind it. Silence communicates something words cannot, that you no longer feel obligated to participate in explanations that used to exhaust you. It tells him you are choosing yourself, that you have accepted what happened, accepted what cannot be changed, and accepted that not every story needs a final conversation. Your silence says, without saying, that you are no longer willing to shrink yourself to maintain a connection. And that message is louder than any speech you could have given, because silence, when rooted in self-worth, is powerful enough to shift the emotional dynamic without a single word spoken. In this new relationship he's in, your boundary stands out even more. The new person may offer him affection, attention, or even love, but they do not erase the memory of the boundary you set. Boundaries linger. They do not fade with time. They become reference points. He compares how easily you once forgave with how firmly you now protect your peace. He remembers the version of you he had access to, and he recognizes the version of you he can no longer reach. That realization is not about wanting you back, it's about understanding that he lost access not due to distance, but due to his own previous actions. Your silence represents that loss more clearly than words ever could. The truth is, your silence shows maturity he didn't expect. People often assume the one who loved more will be the one who breaks first, reaches out first, or bends their boundaries first. But you didn't. You didn't chase closure. You didn't seek validation. You didn't try to revisit old conversations hoping for a different outcome. Instead, you chose quiet, and that quiet reflects growth he wasn't prepared to see. Because while he may have moved on externally, your silence shows that you evolved internally. You chose peace over explanation, dignity over emotional chaos, and self-respect over lingering attachment. That kind of growth forces him to reflect on how differently you are carrying yourself now. What bothers him most is not the silence itself, but what the silence symbolizes, that you learned from the past more deeply than he did. Your boundary proves that you understand your worth in a way you didn't before. It proves that you recognize what deserves your energy and what no longer does. It proves that you are capable of loving deeply, but also capable of walking away fully. And that truth unsettles him because it means you didn't lose in the story he once thought he controlled. Your silence is not emptiness, it is empowerment, and while he may not voice it, he feels the shift every time your name crosses his mind.